The blizzard outside howled with enough force to bury cabins to their roof lines, but Mehitabel Increase slept soundly 15 feet beneath the frozen earth, her small fire barely glowing in the stone hearth. What the settlement above had mocked as madness 6 months earlier had become the only shelter in Dakota Territory that didn't require a man awake all night feeding flames just to survive until dawn. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if engineering that saves lives interests you, subscribe, because tomorrow's story reveals an even more impossible frontier innovation. The dog lifted its head first, ears rotating toward sounds Mehitabel Increase couldn't yet hear through the earth above her sleeping chamber. She opened her eyes to darkness, broken only by the dull orange glow of embers in her stone fireplace. No frost touched the air she breathed. No wind penetrated the silence. The temperature in her underground room remained exactly as it had been when she'd fallen asleep 4 hours earlier, stable and comfortable despite the storm. She knew raged somewhere above 15 feet of frozen Dakota soil. Mehitabel sat up slowly, reaching for the wool blanket folded at the foot of her sleeping platform. She didn't need it for warmth. The earthen walls around her maintained their constant embrace, radiating back the modest heat her small fire had provided before burning down to coals. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders out of habit, a gesture from a lifetime of winter mornings that had required immediate defense against cold. The dog stood and stretched near the tunnel entrance that curved away toward the surface. The animal showed no distress, no indication that anything outside the normal pattern of night and morning had occurred. Mehitabel trusted the dog's instincts more than most human judgment she had encountered in her 43 years of life. She rose from her platform and moved to the fireplace, adding 3 pieces of split wood to the coals, not because the room had grown cold, but because she wanted light and the comfort of flame during waking hours. The wood caught quickly, and firelight spread across walls that bore the marks of her summer's labor. Every surface showed the evidence of careful excavation, smooth in some places where she had followed natural seams in the earth, rougher where she had cut through a harder soil and occasional stone. From a niche carved into the wall beside her sleeping platform, she retrieved her pocket watch. 5:30 in the morning, December 18th, 1841. She wound the mechanism carefully, listening to the familiar click of gears that marked time regardless of whether sun or storm dominated the sky above. Her water bucket, stored near the fireplace's warmth, showed no ice. The condensation she had worried might plague an underground dwelling had never materialized. Mehitabel walked the 15 feet from her sleeping area to the tunnel entrance. The curved passage extended another 20 feet before reaching the surface, angling upward at a grade she had calculated to prevent snow accumulation while allowing easy passage. She had built a wooden door at the exterior opening, sturdy but not designed to bear significant weight. The real protection came from the earth itself and the tunnel's configuration. She heard it then, what the dog had detected minutes earlier. Wind, howling, a voice that spoke of storm beyond anything the settlement had experienced since her arrival 2 years prior. The sound filtered down through 20 feet of tunnel and 15 feet of earth above her chamber, muted and distant but unmistakable. Somewhere above, the Dakota winter was attempting to kill everything that breathed. Mehitabel returned to her fire and sat on the low stool she had built from scrap lumber. She was warm, she was safe, and if her calculations about fuel consumption proved accurate, she had enough split wood stored in the tunnel's upper section to maintain comfortable heat for another 6 weeks without venturing outside. The settlement above would be burning through their winter stores at 3 times her rate, assuming their cabins remained standing against wind that sounded capable of testing even the sturdiest construction. 6 months ago, they had called her mad. Dakota Territory in the spring of 1841 was a place defined by what it lacked. It lacked trees sufficient for proper lumber. It lacked stone suitable for permanent construction. It lacked protection from wind that swept across endless grassland with nothing to slow its passage. What it possessed in abundance was land, grass for livestock, and winters capable of killing anyone foolish enough to underestimate their severity. The settlement that would eventually bear the name Increase Creek consisted of 11 families when Mehitabel arrived in April of 1839. They had come from different eastern states, drawn by government promises of land ownership and the seductive fiction that hard work guaranteed prosperity. Most families built their cabins in the traditional manner because tradition was all they knew. They cut what timber they could find along the creek, hauled it to their claims, and notched logs into walls that would keep out rain and provide some barrier against winter cold. Mehitabel had come west with her husband Thomas and daughter Mercy after losing their farm in Massachusetts to debt. Thomas died of fever 6 weeks after they arrived, leaving Mehitabel with a half-built cabin, a 7-year-old daughter, and land that seemed determined to resist every attempt at cultivation. She finished the cabin herself, learning carpentry through necessity and mistakes. The structure that resulted was typical of the settlement. 4 walls of logs chinked with mud and prairie grass, a sod roof laid over poles, 1 door, 1 window covered with oiled paper, and a stone fireplace that drew poorly but provided enough heat to survive. She and Mercy managed 2 growing seasons. The garden produced adequately. They kept chickens and 1 milk cow. Mehitabel took in sewing and washing from families who could pay in food or trade. It was survival rather than prosperity, but survival counted as success on the Dakota frontier. Other families struggled with similar circumstances. Some thrived through luck or exceptional effort. Others failed and departed. The settlement achieved a precarious stability, growing slowly as new families arrived to replace those who left. Winter defined everything. The growing season existed only to prepare for the months when cold dominated life. Families cut firewood from late summer through autumn, stacking cords against cabin walls until wood surrounded their homes like defensive barriers. They harvested vegetables and stored them in root cellars dug into hillsides. They slaughtered livestock they couldn't feed through winter and preserved the meat. Every action from April through October was calculated against the question of whether it would help survive November through March. The winter of 1839 to 1840 tested the settlement but didn't break it. The winter of 1840 to 1841 was colder, longer, and more brutal. And the winter of 1841 to 1842, the winter that began with the blizzard currently raging above Mehitabel's underground chamber, would prove to be the coldest in living memory. But that knowledge still lay ahead, unrevealed, when Mehitabel's world changed forever in February of 1841. February 17, 1841, began as an ordinary winter day. Cold, but not exceptionally so. Clear sky suggesting no immediate storm. Mehitabel spent the morning on indoor tasks while Mercy practiced letters on her slate. They ate a midday meal of cornbread and beans. The cabin's interior temperature hovered somewhere above freezing, maintained by a fire that Mehitabel fed steadily throughout the day. By afternoon, the temperature outside began dropping with unusual speed. Mehitabel noticed it first when she went outside to retrieve more firewood from the stack against the north wall. The air carried a quality she had learned to recognize over 2 Dakota winters, a particular stillness that preceded the worst cold. She brought in extra wood, stacking it near the fireplace where it would be easily accessible throughout the night. Sunset brought confirmation of her instinct. The thermometer mounted outside her door read 10 degrees below zero. By the time Mehitabel put Mercy to bed at 8 o'clock, it had fallen to 20 below. She built up the fire larger than usual, filling the firebox with split logs and adjusting the damper to slow the burn rate. She woke at midnight to add wood. The cabin's interior temperature had dropped noticeably despite the fire. She could see her breath in the air more than 5 feet from the hearth. She added 4 large logs, checked on Mercy, who slept beneath every blanket they owned, and returned to her own bed. 2 hours later, she woke shivering. The fire had burned down faster than expected. She rebuilt it again, noting that the cold seemed to be winning against the heat her fireplace could produce. The logs in the walls were contracting in the extreme temperature, opening gaps in the chinking. Wind found these gaps and exploited them. At 4 in the morning, Mehitabel gave up on sleep. She sat by the fire, feeding it constantly, trying to maintain enough heat to keep the cabin's interior above freezing. She checked Mercy twice and found her daughter sleeping, breath visible in the air above the blankets. Dawn revealed a thermometer reading of 47 degrees below zero. Mehitabel had never seen such a temperature. She kept the fire burning as hot as the fireplace would allow, but the cabin's interior remained brutally cold. Ice formed on face. The interior walls, where moisture from breathing had condensed and frozen. Mercy woke complaining of cold. Mehitabel brought her to the fireplace, wrapping her in blankets and holding her close to the flames. The child's breathing seemed labored, each breath a visible cloud. Mehitabel made hot tea, forcing Mercy to drink it for the warmth, but something was wrong. Mercy's lips carried a blue tinge that had nothing to do with cold alone. By mid-morning, Mercy couldn't get warm, despite sitting directly before the fire. Her breathing grew worse, shallow and rapid. Mehitabel recognized the signs of what frontier families called winter lung, a condition where extreme cold damaged the lungs beyond recovery. She held her daughter, keeping her as close to the fire as safety allowed, but Mercy's condition deteriorated through the afternoon. By sunset, the child who had been healthy at breakfast was gone, killed by cold, that no amount of fire could overcome in a cabin built with gaps that allowed heat to escape faster than burning wood could replace it. Mehitabel buried Mercy 3 days later. In ground so frozen, it required a fire to thaw the earth enough for digging. Preserved Goodwin and 2 other men from the settlement helped with the work, breaking through frost that extended down 4 feet before reaching soil soft enough to accept a shovel. They buried the child on a low rise east of Mehitabel's cabin, marked the grave with a wooden cross, and offered condolences that meant nothing against the weight of loss. The settlement had lost 2 other people that week. An elderly man had frozen to death when his fire went out during the night. A young woman had developed pneumonia and died before the temperature moderated. Death in winter was common enough that the community had developed rituals for acknowledging it and moving forward. But Mehitabel didn't move forward. She remained fixed on a question that seemed to trouble no one else. Why had her fire been insufficient? She had maintained it throughout the night. She had used good hardwood that burned hot and long, and still the cabin's interior had grown cold enough to kill her daughter. Other families had survived the same night in cabins no better than hers. This should have offered comfort, but instead it made Mehitabel angry. The randomness of who lived and who died felt like an equation with missing variables. Some cabins stayed warm enough, others didn't. The difference couldn't be only fire management because families using identical methods experienced different outcomes. She began paying attention to details she had previously ignored. The Wilcox family had a cabin similar to hers, but they burned noticeably more firewood to achieve the same interior temperature. The Hannigan family had built their cabin into a hillside, using the slope as one wall. They reported using less firewood and maintaining more stable heat. Preserved Goodwin's cabin, built with exceptional care, still suffered from drafts that no amount of chinking seemed to eliminate. Mehitabel walked through the settlement in late February, ostensibly visiting neighbors but actually studying their cabins. She looked at how logs were notched and fitted. She examined chinking techniques. She noted which cabins had been built on high ground versus low areas. She asked questions about firewood consumption and interior temperature that most families found peculiar, but answered out of sympathy for her recent loss. A pattern emerged slowly. The best insulated cabins still required massive amounts of firewood to maintain livable temperature in extreme cold. The worst cabins were death traps that no amount of fire could adequately heat. But even the best cabin was only marginally better than the worst when temperature dropped to 40 below zero. The entire approach seemed fundamentally flawed. One observation stuck in her mind. The Hannigan family's semi-dugout cabin built partially into the hillside, stayed warmer with less fuel than any above-ground structure. Mehitabel asked Ruth Hannigan about this directly. Ruth attributed it to wind protection, but Mehitabel suspected something more was at work, some property of being partially underground that changed the equation of heat and cold. Mehitabel announced her intention to dig into the hillside during a Sunday gathering in early April of 1841. The settlement met weekly at the Goodwin cabin for informal worship and discussion of shared concerns. Elder Hezekiah Stone, a Massachusetts minister who had come west with his congregation, led prayers and facilitated conversations about matters affecting everyone. The meeting that day had covered routine topics: planting schedules, shared use of draft animals, plans for a proper church building. Mehitabel had sat quietly through most of it, but when Elder Stone asked if anyone had additional matters to raise, she stood and stated her plan with clarity that allowed no room for misunderstanding. She would not rebuild her cabin. She would instead excavate a dwelling into the south-facing hillside near her claim. She would live underground through the next winter, protected by earth rather than logs, heated by thermal mass rather than constant fire. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then Preserved Goodwin spoke, his tone carrying the careful patience used with those whose grief has temporarily unbalanced their thinking. He expressed sympathy for her loss and suggested that perhaps her current plan reflected emotional distress rather than practical consideration. Elder Stone took a different approach. He cited scripture about mankind's dominion over the earth, about how God had created humans to live upon the ground, not within it. Living underground was appropriate for animals, not for Christians. The objections multiplied. Underground dwellings would flood with rain. They would collapse and bury their occupants. They would lack adequate air for breathing. They would be dark, damp, and diseased. Mehitabel listened to each objection and responded with the same statement. She would begin excavation in May. Anyone who wished to observe her methods or learn from her attempt was welcome. Anyone who wished to mock or discourage her should stay away. Then she left the gathering and walked back to her cabin alone. Over the next 3 weeks, visitors came to her claim with various intentions. Some wanted to convince her to abandon the plan. Others came out of curiosity. Elder Stone visited twice, presenting theological arguments. Preserved Goodwin came with practical objections about structural stability and ventilation. Only one person responded with uncomplicated interest. Consider Makepeace, a 12-year-old boy from one of the newer families, appeared at her cabin one afternoon and asked direct questions. How deep would she dig? How would she prevent collapse? Where would smoke go? Mehitabel answered each question honestly, explaining what she knew and admitting what remained uncertain. The boy listened, nodded, and returned home without expressing either support or criticism. Mehitabel's certainty about underground dwelling came from memories she had never previously considered significant. Her father had worked iron in western Massachusetts, operating a small forge that produced tools and hardware for local farms. The forge had been built partially into a hillside. The back wall was earth, packed and hardened by heat over years of use. Mehitabel remembered her father explaining that the earth wall absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night, helping maintain temperature stability. She also remembered the root cellar at their Massachusetts farm. Dug 8 feet into a slope, lined with stone, covered with a thick timber and earth roof. The cellar had maintained nearly constant temperature year-round. Vegetables stored there in autumn remained fresh through winter. In summer, the cellar provided cool storage for dairy and meat. Her father had claimed the temperature inside varied less than 10 degrees between January and July. These memories suggested principles that most frontier settlers either didn't know or had forgotten. Earth, when used properly, provided superior insulation to anything humans could construct from wood or stone. Below a certain depth, soil temperature remained stable regardless of surface weather. Thermal mass absorbed and released heat slowly, dampening the extreme fluctuations that made surface dwellings difficult to keep comfortable. Mehitabel had also heard stories from a Welsh miner who had passed through the settlement the previous autumn. The man had worked copper mines in his home country, spending entire shifts hundreds of feet underground. He described how mines maintained constant temperature, requiring no heating in winter and staying cool in summer. Miners in some regions actually lived in caverns during harsh weather, finding underground shelter more reliable than surface structures. She thought about animals. Prairie dogs excavated elaborate tunnel systems that housed entire colonies through winter. Badgers dug deep burrows that protected them from temperature extremes. Bears denned in caves or dug shelters where they survived months without external heat sources. These animals weren't stupid. They were responding to environmental pressure with solutions that worked. The more Mehitabel considered these observations, the more obvious the solution seemed. Humans built above ground because tradition dictated it, because visible structures demonstrated ownership and civilization. But tradition didn't prevent freezing to death. Engineering principles and thermal physics did. She began planning her excavation with careful attention to detail. She would need to select the right location, hillside, with proper drainage and soil composition. She would need to calculate the correct depth to reach stable earth temperature. She would need to design ventilation that provided fresh air without creating channels for heat loss. She would need to build a fireplace and chimney system that could vent smoke while taking advantage of Earth's thermal mass. Most critically, she would need to excavate safely, preventing collapse during construction. She had no training in mining or excavation, but she had common sense and the ability to learn from observation. She would proceed slowly, testing each decision, building in safety margins that professionals might consider excessive, but that seemed prudent for someone working alone. Mehitabel began digging on May 3, 1841. She had selected a hillside on the southern edge of her claim, a gentle slope with good drainage and soil that was neither too sandy nor too heavy with clay. The location faced south, which would allow winter sun to reach the tunnel entrance and prevent snow from drifting against the door. She had studied the hillside during spring rains, confirming that water ran off rather than pooling or seeping into the slope. She started with a vertical cut into the hillside, creating a face approximately 6 feet wide and 7 feet high. This would become the entrance. She removed earth one shovel at a time, piling it to the side where it wouldn't interfere with further work. The digging was harder than she had anticipated. Her hands blistered within the first hour. Her shoulders and back ached by midday. But she continued, establishing a rhythm that allowed steady progress without exhausting herself completely. By the end of the first day, she had cut roughly 3 feet into the hillside. She examined the exposed earth carefully, looking for signs of instability or unexpected soil conditions. The earth showed clear layering, darker topsoil giving way to lighter clay beneath. The layers appeared stable, with no evidence of loose gravel or excessive moisture. Elderstone appeared on the second day of excavation. He stood at a distance, watching her work before speaking. He asked if she had considered what would happen when rain saturated the earth above her tunnel, whether she understood that wet soil weighed considerably more than dry earth. Mehitabel stopped digging and leaned on her shovel. She acknowledged that she lacked formal training. She admitted that risks existed, but she also noted that her daughter had died in a cabin built using methods everyone considered safe and proper. Risk was relative. She would rather die trying something new than watch another winter kill people in structures that provided inadequate protection. Elderstone had no response. He stood silently for a moment, then advised her to be careful and departed. He didn't return to her excavation site again. Consider Makepeace appeared on the 4th day. The boy watched her work with obvious fascination, asking questions about her technique and intentions. How far would the tunnel extend? Where would she put the living space? Mehitabel explained her plan as she worked. The tunnel would extend back into the hillside at a slight upward angle. After approximately 20 feet, she would excavate a larger chamber for living space. She would install timber supports where needed. The boy asked if he could help. Consider explained that his father had given permission for him to work for her 2 days per week in exchange for learning her excavation methods. His father apparently believed that watching Mehitabel's attempt would provide educational value even if the project failed. The tunnel progressed at a rate of approximately 2 feet per day when Mehitabel worked alone, 3 feet per day when Consider Makepeace joined her. The boy proved surprisingly capable with a shovel, and his smaller size allowed him to work in cramped spaces where Mehitabel struggled to maneuver. They developed a rhythm where one person dug while the other hauled excavated earth to the surface in buckets fashioned from old barrel sections. Mehitabel maintained a slight upward angle as the tunnel extended into the hillside, rising approximately 1 inch for every foot of horizontal progress. This grade was subtle enough to remain comfortable for walking, but sufficient to ensure that any water entering the tunnel would drain toward the entrance rather than pooling in the living chamber. She tested the angle regularly using a string and plumb bob, adjusting the floor level as needed to maintain consistent slope. After 15 feet of tunnel, she began excavating the main chamber. This required different technique than tunnel work. Instead of cutting straight ahead, she widened the passage gradually, creating a space approximately 12 feet wide, 14 feet deep, and 7 feet high at the center. The ceiling followed a gentle arch rather than remaining flat, a design choice based on her observation that arched structures distributed weight more effectively than flat spans. The excavation process revealed the Earth's layered composition. The first 3 feet consisted of dark topsoil rich in organic matter. Below that lay 4 feet of dense clay, brown and sticky when wet, but hard as stone when dry. Deeper still, she encountered layers of sand and gravel intermixed with more clay. Each layer had different structural properties. The clay was self-supporting and required no reinforcement. The sandy layers were less stable and needed timber bracing. Mehitabel installed support beams at 2 locations where the ceiling composition seemed questionable. She used pine logs roughly 8 inches in diameter, set vertically as posts with horizontal beams spanning between them. The posts rested on flat stones to prevent them from gradually sinking into the earthen floor. The horizontal beams were notched to sit securely atop the posts, creating a frame that would catch falling earth if the ceiling developed cracks or instability. Ventilation concerned her more than structural collapse. She needed fresh air circulation to prevent suffocation and to allow her fireplace to draw properly. She solved this by creating a secondary shaft that angled upward from the back corner of her living chamber to the surface 20 feet above. The shaft was only 6 inches in diameter, too small for significant heat loss but adequate for air exchange. She lined it with stones to prevent collapse and covered the surface opening with a wooden cap that kept out rain while allowing air passage. The fireplace represented the most technically challenging element of Mehitabel's underground dwelling. She needed a structure that would provide heat, allow cooking, vent smoke to the surface, and take advantage of Earth's thermal mass without creating fire hazards or structural weaknesses in the surrounding soil. She had never built a fireplace from scratch, but she had watched her father construct 2 of them in Massachusetts and had helped him gather and sort stones for the work. She began collecting rocks in early June, searching creek beds and exposed outcroppings for stones with the right properties. She needed flat stones for the firebox floor, stones that could withstand repeated heating and cooling without cracking. She needed angular stones for the walls, pieces that would stack securely and create stable vertical surfaces. She needed large flat stones for the hearth, the area in front of the fireplace where sparks might land. And she needed clay, lots of it, to bind the stones together and seal gaps against smoke leakage. The fireplace location was critical. She placed it in the corner of her chamber farthest from the entrance, reasoning that this position would allow the stone mass to absorb and radiate heat most effectively into the living space. She dug down 2 feet below her floor level to create a foundation, filling the pit with large stones set in clay. This foundation would prevent the fireplace from settling unevenly and would provide thermal mass beneath the firebox. She built the firebox 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 2 feet high, dimensions based on her memory of her father's work and her own calculations about what size fire would provide adequate heat without consuming excessive fuel. The back wall of the firebox angled forward slightly, a feature she remembered from efficient fireplaces that reflected heat outward into the room. She used her flattest stones for this back wall, fitting them carefully and filling joints with clay mixed with sand. The chimney proved most difficult. It needed to rise vertically from the firebox, pass through 7 feet of earth and timber ceiling supports, and emerge above the hillside surface high enough that wind wouldn't blow smoke back down. She constructed it using a technique of progressively smaller stone rings, each layer stepping inward slightly to create a tapering passage approximately 1 foot in diameter. She plastered the interior with clay to create a smooth surface that would promote draft and prevent creosote buildup. With the main chamber excavated and the fireplace completed, Mehitabel turned her attention to interior construction. The earthen space needed to become livable, equipped with the basic furnishings and systems necessary for daily life through a Dakota winter. She worked with materials salvaged from her old cabin and supplemented with new construction where salvage proved inadequate. She built her sleeping platform first, positioning it along the wall opposite the fireplace at a height of 2 feet above the floor. The elevation served multiple purposes. It provided storage space beneath for supplies that needed to remain dry. It positioned her sleeping surface at a level where heat from the fireplace would reach most effectively, warm air rising to fill the upper portion of the chamber, while cold air settled near the floor. And it kept her off the earthen floor, preventing moisture transfer that might occur through direct contact with soil. The platform measured 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, adequate for one person with space for blankets and a pillow. She constructed the frame from salvaged lumber, joining pieces with wooden pegs rather than precious nails. She laid planks across the frame to create a sleeping surface, leaving small gaps between boards to allow air circulation beneath. Over the planks, she placed a mattress tick filled with prairie grass that she had dried through summer. The grass provided cushioning and insulation superior to sleeping directly on wood. Storage presented unique opportunities in an underground dwelling. Unlike a cabin where wall space was limited and required structural logs, her earthen walls could be carved to create niches and shelves at any location. She cut a series of rectangular openings into the wall near her sleeping platform, creating compartments for personal items, candles, matches, and other small necessities. The niches ranged from 6 inches to 2 feet, deep depending on the soil composition at each location. Clay areas allowed deeper cuts while sandy sections required shallower excavations to maintain stability. She carved a larger alcove near the fireplace for food storage, a space approximately 3 feet wide, 2 feet high, and 18 inches deep. She lined this space with flat stones to deter mice and insects, creating a primitive cupboard that would keep flour, cornmeal, dried beans, and other staples organized and accessible. The location near the fireplace provided drier conditions than other areas of the chamber, important for preventing mold growth on stored food. Water storage required careful consideration. She needed drinking water readily available, but she couldn't risk significant spillage that might saturate the earthen floor and create mud. She placed a 10-gallon wooden bucket on a raised platform near the entrance tunnel, positioned where she could easily refill it from trips to the creek, but far enough from the sleeping and cooking areas that any drips wouldn't create problems. The bucket sat on a wooden pallet that kept it off the earthen floor and provided air circulation beneath. For seating and workspace, she built a simple bench and table using salvaged cabin lumber. The bench stood 2 feet high and ran along one wall for 6 feet, providing both seating and additional storage underneath. The table was small, just 3 feet square, but adequate for food preparation and eating. She positioned it near the fireplace where light from flames would illuminate work during evening hours. Mehitabel completed her underground dwelling on September 22, 1841. The work had consumed nearly 5 months of continuous effort, far longer than the 4 days required to build a conventional cabin, but the result bore no resemblance to standard frontier construction. She stood at the entrance tunnel as afternoon sun angled through the opening, illuminating the space she had created beneath 15 feet of Dakota earth. The chamber felt different from any structure she had inhabited. The air carried a particular quality, cool and stable, untouched by the temperature fluctuations that characterize surface buildings. The earthen walls showed the marks of her excavation, some surfaces smooth where clay had allowed careful shaping, others rougher where she had cut through gravel or encountered stones. The ceiling curved overhead in its gentle arch, supported by timber beams at 2 locations, but mostly relying on the earth's natural compression. Her fireplace occupied the far corner, its stone construction solid and professional-looking, despite her amateur status. She had tested it 3 times during construction, burning small fires to verify draft and smoke venting. The system worked perfectly, drawing air from the entrance tunnel and the ventilation shaft, sending smoke upward through the chimney without any backflow into the living space. The stones absorbed heat during burning and continued radiating warmth hours after flames died to coals. She moved her possessions into the dwelling over the course of 2 days. Her salvaged furniture, her clothing and bedding, her cooking utensils and tools, the small collection of books she had carried from Massachusetts. Everything fit easily in the space she had created, with room to spare. The carved storage niches held far more than she had anticipated, and the area beneath her sleeping platform accommodated supplies she had worried about storing. On September 24th, 2 days after completion, Preserved Goodwin arrived at her claim, leading a delegation of 5 men from the settlement. Elder Stone was among them, along with 3 farmers whose opinions carried weight in community decisions. They stood at the entrance to her tunnel, looking into the passage that curved away into darkness. Preserved spoke for the group, his tone carrying none of the gentle condescension he had used in previous conversations. They had come to warn her, officially and formally, that her dwelling was unsafe, that living underground through winter represented foolish risk that would likely result in her death, that the settlement could not in good conscience allow her to proceed with this plan without expressing strong opposition, that if she insisted on this course, she did so against community advice and would bear sole responsibility for the consequences. Mehitabel listened without interruption. When Preserved finished, she thanked them for their concern and told them she would indeed proceed as planned. She invited them to inspect the dwelling if they wished, to examine her construction methods and form their own judgments about safety. Only consider Makepeace's father accepted, walking through the tunnel and into the chamber, studying the fireplace and supports with careful attention, before emerging and stating that the work appeared sound, though he still questioned the wisdom of the entire enterprise. October arrived with temperatures that dropped faster than normal seasonal progression suggested. By the 10th of the month, morning frost covered the prairie grass, and settlers began burning fires throughout the day, rather than only during evening hours. Mehitabel moved permanently into her underground dwelling on October 5th, carrying the last of her supplies down the tunnel and closing the exterior door behind her for the first time as a full-time resident rather than a visitor to her own construction project. The transition from surface life to underground existence required adjustments she hadn't fully anticipated. The absence of windows meant no natural light beyond what filtered through the tunnel entrance. She burned candles during daytime hours when she needed to see clearly, rationing them carefully and relying on firelight when possible. The constant temperature, which she had designed the dwelling to provide, felt strange after a lifetime of experiencing daily temperature swings. The chamber maintained approximately 55 degrees without any fire, the Earth's stable temperature at this depth expressing itself in her living space. When she did light fires for cooking or additional warmth, the temperature rose to 65 or 70 degrees and remained there for hours. After the flames died, the thermal mass of stone fireplace and earthen walls absorbed heat and released it slowly, exactly as she had theorized. A fire that would have heated a cabin for 2 hours provided warmth in her chamber for 6 or 8 hours. The first significant cold arrived on October 19th. Temperature dropped to 15 degrees overnight, cold enough that surface cabins required substantial fires to maintain livable conditions. Mehitabel burned a moderate fire in her fireplace from evening through bedtime, then allowed it to die to coals. She woke the next morning to find the chamber temperature at 62 degrees, comfortable, enough that she needed only a light shawl over her nightdress. The earthen insulation had prevented any cold penetration, and the thermal mass had sustained warmth through the night. She walked to the settlement that afternoon, ostensibly to purchase cornmeal from a family that had surplus, but actually to observe how others had fared through the cold night. Every cabin she passed showed evidence of heavy fire use. Smoke poured from chimneys. Wood piles showed noticeably depleted levels. Women hanging laundry complained about how much fuel their families had burned just to keep from freezing. No one asked about her night, and she didn't volunteer information. But when she returned to her dwelling that evening, she calculated fuel consumption carefully. She had burned approximately 1/8 the wood that a surface cabin would have required for the same period. If that ratio held through winter, her prepared firewood supply would last 5 times longer than conventional planning. Suggested necessary. Consider Makepeace appeared at her tunnel entrance 3 days later. The boy asked permission to enter, then stood in her chamber, looking around with obvious fascination. He touched the earthen walls, examined the fireplace construction, and asked technical questions about temperature and fuel use. Mehitabel answered honestly, sharing her observations and calculations. The boy listened carefully, asked if he could tell his father what he had learned, and departed when she gave permission. November brought colder weather and the first significant snowfall of the season. 6 inches accumulated on the 5th, followed by temperatures that remained below freezing for 8 consecutive days. Surface cabins struggled with the sustained cold, requiring fires that consumed alarming amounts of firewood. Families began worrying aloud about whether their winter supplies would last until spring, calculating remaining cords against weeks of winter still ahead. Widow silence. Bowen appeared at Mehitabel's tunnel entrance on November 10th. She stood at the exterior door, calling down the passage rather than entering uninvited. Mehitabel emerged from her chamber and found Silence waiting, wrapped in multiple shawls despite the moderate afternoon temperature. The widow asked if she might see the underground dwelling, if the stories she had heard about its warmth and fuel efficiency were accurate. Mehitabel invited her inside. Silence followed her down the tunnel, exclaiming softly as the temperature increased with each step away from the exterior opening. By the time they reached the living chamber, Silence had removed her outer shawl. She stood in the center of the space, turning slowly to examine walls, ceiling, fireplace, and furnishings. The chamber temperature stood at 60 degrees, though Mehitabel hadn't burned a fire since the previous evening. Silence asked permission to touch the earthen walls. She placed her palm against the clay surface and held it there for several seconds, feeling the stable coolness that never varied. She examined the fireplace, noting its construction and the amount of ash present. She looked at Mehitabel's firewood supply, stored in the tunnel near the entrance, and asked how much had been consumed since October. When Mehitabel explained that she had used less than 1 cord in 5 weeks, Silence went quiet for a long moment. The widow explained that her own cabin had consumed nearly 3 cords in the same period. She was a careful woman who managed resources efficiently, yet her firewood supply was depleting at a rate that frightened her. She had begun rationing heat, allowing her cabin temperature to drop uncomfortably low between fire feedings to stretch her remaining supply. She was cold most of the time, sleeping poorly, waking to frozen water buckets and frost on interior walls. She asked how Mehitabel had learned to build such a dwelling. Mehitabel explained the observations and memories that had led to her design, the principles of earth insulation and thermal mass. The calculation that below a certain depth, the earth maintained constant temperature regardless of surface weather. She didn't claim expertise or special knowledge, only willingness to try something different after watching conventional methods fail. Silence asked if the dwelling ever felt unsafe, whether the ceiling showed any signs of settling or cracking, whether moisture accumulated or drainage failed, whether smoke venting worked reliably. Mehitabel answered each question honestly. The structure had performed exactly as designed. She felt safer here than she ever had in her surface cabin, and far warmer, with fraction of the fuel consumption. The widow stood silently for several minutes, clearly thinking through implications. Finally, she asked the question that would change everything. Would Mehitabel be willing to help her build a similar dwelling? Not immediately, but perhaps in spring when excavation became possible again? Silence had a claim with suitable hillside. She had no husband to object to unconventional plans, and she was tired of being cold. The blizzard arrived on December 17, 1841, exactly 1 year and 10 months after Mehitabel had arrived in Dakota Territory. Weather preceding the storm gave little warning. Temperature hovered near 20 degrees for several days, cold but manageable. Wind remained light. Sky showed high clouds, but nothing suggesting imminent severe weather. Then, late afternoon on the 17th, the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours, and wind began building from the northwest. By sunset, full blizzard conditions dominated the landscape. Wind exceeded 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the prairie, with enough force to strip bark from exposed trees. Temperature plunged to 30 below zero, then kept falling. Visibility dropped to zero as snow filled the air so thickly that objects 5 feet away disappeared into white chaos. The storm continued through the night, into the next day, and through a second night without pause. Mehitabel experienced the blizzard from 15 feet beneath its fury. She knew severe weather raged above because wind noise penetrated even through earth and tunnel, a distant howling that spoke of deadly conditions on the surface. But inside her chamber, temperature remained stable at 58 degrees. She burned a small fire for light and cooking, using perhaps 1/10 the wood a surface cabin would require. She read by firelight, worked on mending, slept comfortably under a single blanket. The tunnel entrance accumulated snow despite its angled configuration. She had anticipated this and had stored 2 weeks of firewood inside the tunnel within easy reach of her chamber. She had water for drinking and cooking. She had food supplies adequate for a month. Even if the blizzard buried her entrance completely, she could survive comfortably until she excavated her way out. Surface cabins fared catastrophically worse. The Wilcox family burned through a full cord of wood in 36 hours trying to maintain temperature above freezing. Their cabin's chinking had dried and cracked during autumn, creating gaps that wind exploited mercilessly. Despite constant fire, interior temperature never rose above 40 degrees. They huddled near the hearth in every piece of clothing they owned, burning furniture when firewood ran low, terrified of the fire going out. The Hannigan family, whose semi-dugout cabin had partly inspired Mehitabel's design, survived more comfortably than most but still struggled. Their earth-backed wall provided better insulation than conventional construction, but 3 walls remained fully exposed to wind and cold. They burned 2 cords of wood during the storm and considered themselves fortunate to have adequate supply. Preserved Goodwin's cabin, built with exceptional care using the best available materials, proved that even superior conventional construction had fundamental limitations. Despite thick walls and careful chinking, despite a well-designed fireplace and adequate fuel supply, the cabin barely maintained livable temperature. Goodwin and his family spent 2 days huddled near their fire, burning wood continuously, sleeping in shifts to ensure someone always maintained the flames. When the storm finally passed on the morning of December 19th, they emerged exhausted from 48 hours of constant fire tending. The day after the blizzard ended, Mehitabel emerged from her tunnel to find the settlement transformed. Snow had drifted against every cabin, some structures buried to their roof lines on the north side. Smoke rose from every chimney as families worked to restore warmth to buildings that had grown dangerously cold despite continuous fire burning. The temperature remained below zero, and wind continued, though with less violence than during the storm's peak. She walked through the settlement, observing damage and listening to stories. 3 families had burned through more than half their winter firewood supply in 2 days. One cabin's chimney had cracked from thermal stress caused by desperate overheating. The elderly couple living farthest from the settlement center had nearly died when their fire went out during the second night. A neighbor checking on them after the storm found them hypothermic but alive, huddled under every blanket they owned in a cabin whose interior temperature had dropped below freezing. No one mocked Mehitabel's underground dwelling anymore. The questions she received carried genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. How had she stayed warm? How much fuel had she used? Had she felt safe with Earth overhead during the storm? She answered honestly, explaining that she had remained comfortable throughout, burning minimal wood, never doubting the structure's integrity. Silence Bowen arrived at Mehitabel's claim 3 days after the blizzard with a formal request. She wanted to begin planning her own underground dwelling for construction the following spring. She asked if Mehitabel would teach her the excavation techniques, the proper depth and ventilation requirements, the fireplace construction methods. She offered payment in the form of labor, food, or whatever Mehitabel needed. Mehitabel agreed without requesting payment. She suggested they begin by selecting Silence's building site, examining her hillside for proper slope and drainage. The 2 women spent an afternoon walking Silence's claim, evaluating potential locations, discussing orientation and entrance placement. Mehitabel explained the principles she had followed, sharing knowledge that had come from observation and experimentation rather than formal training. Consider Makepeace's father appeared the following week. His request was more tentative. He wondered if his son might continue learning from Mehitabel, perhaps helping with any projects she undertook, and he admitted with visible reluctance that he was considering building an earth-sheltered dwelling himself. Not immediately, but within the next year or 2. He had watched his family burn through firewood at unsustainable rates during the blizzard, while Mehitabel remained comfortable underground. The economics alone justified consideration of alternative construction. By mid-January, 3 more families had approached Mehitabel asking about underground dwelling construction. The blizzard had demonstrated with brutal clarity that conventional cabins provided inadequate protection against extreme weather. Families could either accept this reality and continue risking their lives, or they could adopt methods that physics proved superior to tradition. Preserved Goodwin visited in late January. He didn't apologize for his earlier skepticism, but he asked detailed questions about structural engineering and excavation safety. He was a careful man who made decisions based on evidence rather than impulse. The evidence now suggested that Mehitabel's approach offered advantages that conventional construction couldn't match. Spring of 1842 brought a transformation to the settlement that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. 5 families began excavation projects in April, each digging into hillsides on their claims following principles Mehitabel had established. She spent her days traveling between sites, offering advice on depth and drainage, demonstrating proper support beam placement, helping design fireplace and chimney systems. Consider Makepeace worked alongside her, the boy having become her unofficial apprentice in earth construction techniques. The dwellings that emerged varied in details but shared fundamental design. All extended far enough underground to reach stable earth temperature. All used curved entrance tunnels as thermal airlocks. All incorporated stone fireplaces with proper venting. all relied on Earth's insulation and thermal mass rather than burning excessive fuel. By autumn of 1842, 6 underground dwellings existed in the settlement, including Mehitabel's original structure. The winter of 1842 to 1843 tested these new dwellings against the same conditions that had nearly killed families the previous year. Temperature dropped below zero dozens of times. Several blizzards struck with wind and snow comparable to the December storm. But families in earth-sheltered dwellings remained comfortable, burning 1/4 the firewood that surface cabins required, maintaining stable interior temperatures, sleeping through storms rather than tending fires in desperate shifts. Word spread to neighboring settlements. Travelers who visited during winter noticed the unusual number of families living underground and asked questions. Some expressed skepticism identical to what Mehitabel had faced. Others recognized the practical advantages immediately and carried the information back to their own communities. By 1844, earth-sheltered dwellings were being constructed across southern Dakota Territory and into northern Nebraska. Variations emerged as different builders adapted the basic principles to local conditions. Some excavated into steeper hillsides, creating multi-level chambers connected by interior passages. Others built partially underground with earth bermed against walls rather than fully excavating beneath the surface. A few combined earth shelter with conventional cabin construction, using underground space for sleeping and storage while maintaining surface structures for daytime activities. Preserved Goodwin built his earth dwelling in 1843, applying his characteristic attention to detail and creating what became the settlement's most sophisticated underground structure. He incorporated features Mehitabel hadn't attempted, including a stone-lined drainage system beneath the floor and a secondary chamber for food storage. His dwelling demonstrated that earth construction could be refined beyond basic survival shelter into genuinely comfortable permanent housing. Elder Stone never built an underground dwelling. He maintained his surface cabin until 1846 when he returned east, unable to reconcile frontier realities with theological convictions about proper human habitation. But before departing, he acknowledged privately to Mehitabel that her methods had proven effective, regardless of whether they aligned with scriptural interpretation. Lives had been saved, families had survived winters that might otherwise have killed them. Those outcomes justified techniques he remained theologically uncomfortable endorsing. By 1845, more than half the settlement's families lived partially or entirely underground during winter months. The transformation from mockery to adoption had required less than 4 years. The spring of 1843 marked a turning point in how frontier settlements approached winter survival. Dakota Territory communities that had lost members to cold weather during previous winters reported 0 weather-related deaths that season. The correlation with earth-sheltered dwelling adoption was obvious enough that even skeptical observers acknowledged the connection. Building into hillsides rather than only upon them saved lives with measurable certainty. Mehitabel found herself teaching construction techniques to people she had never met, visitors who traveled specifically to learn from her experience. She developed a systematic approach to instruction, beginning with site selection principles and progressing through excavation safety, structural support, ventilation design, and fireplace construction. She taught perhaps 30 people over 2 years, each of whom returned to their own settlements and built dwellings that demonstrated what they had learned. The technique spread beyond Dakota Territory. By 1846, earth-sheltered construction was being practiced in Montana Territory, northern Wyoming, and the western Dakotas. The designs evolved as builders encountered different soil conditions and climate variations. Clay-heavy soil in some regions allowed larger, unsupported spans. Rocky terrain required more extensive stonework and different excavation approaches, but the fundamental principle remained constant. Earth below the frost line provided superior insulation and thermal mass compared to any above-ground construction possible with frontier resources. Mehitabel continued living in her original dwelling, making occasional improvements, but finding little need for major modifications. The structure that had taken 5 months to build in 1841 remained completely sound 5 years later. The earthen walls showed no deterioration. The timber supports remained solid. The fireplace drew as efficiently as when first constructed. She had created something that would outlast conventional cabins by decades. She maintained correspondence with several people she had taught, sharing observations and learning from their experiences in different conditions. This informal network of earth builders developed refinements that improved on her original methods, better chimney designs that drew more efficiently, improved ventilation systems that provided fresh air with minimal heat loss, techniques for waterproofing that worked better than her clay and stone approaches. Consider Makepeace, now 15 years old, had become an accomplished excavator and designer in his own right. He built earth dwellings for 3 families during 1844, incorporating innovations he had developed through careful observation and experimentation. He treated earth construction as engineering rather than mere shelter building, calculating load distributions and thermal properties with surprising sophistication for someone without formal education. The settlement's transformation extended beyond individual dwellings. By 1845, families were excavating shared root cellars that served multiple households, underground storage facilities that maintained stable, cool temperatures year-round. Some families built underground workshops where activities requiring temperature control could continue through winter. The community was learning to use earth as infrastructure rather than simply as building material. Mehitabel watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. She had never sought recognition or credit for innovation. She had simply refused to accept that winter must kill people when engineering solutions existed. That refusal, combined with willingness to act on observations others had dismissed, had changed how an entire region approached survival. Mehitabel Increase lived in her underground dwelling until 1863, 22 years after its construction. She was 65 years old when she finally abandoned the structure, not because it had failed, but because she was moving to live with Consider Makepeace and his wife, who had invited her to share their home as age made independent living difficult. The dwelling she left behind remained structurally sound, its earthen walls and stone fireplace as solid as the day she had completed them. She died in 1869 at age 71, surrounded by people who remembered when the settlement had mocked her for digging into a hillside. Her funeral drew attendees from 3 territories, many of whom lived in earth-sheltered dwellings built using techniques they had learned directly or indirectly from her example. Elder Stone's replacement gave a eulogy that praised her practical wisdom and engineering skill, making no mention of theological objections to underground habitation. The network of earth dwellings she had inspired continued spreading through the northern plains for another 2 decades. By 1870, earth-sheltered construction was common enough in Dakota and Montana territories that new settlers considered it a standard option rather than unusual innovation. Government land office advisors recommended earth-dwelling construction to homesteaders in regions with harsh winters and limited timber. Army posts built partially underground structures for winter quarters. The specific techniques evolved as professional engineers encountered the methods frontier builders had developed through experimentation. Improved waterproofing materials became available. Better understanding of soil mechanics led to safer excavation practices. But the fundamental principles Mehitabel had proven remained unchanged. Earth provided superior insulation and thermal mass. Proper depth and ventilation created stable, comfortable environments. Fireplace design that utilized thermal mass reduced fuel consumption dramatically. Some of the original dwellings built in the 1840s remained occupied into the 1880s. Mehitabel's structure stood empty but intact until 1892, when the hillside was cleared for agricultural expansion. Even then, crews excavating the site noted that the dwelling's interior showed minimal deterioration after 5 decades. Its earthen walls compressed and hardened into surfaces nearly as solid as concrete. The historical record of Mehitabel's innovation is fragmentary. No newspapers chronicled her work. No official documents praised her engineering. She left no written account of her methods or motivations. What survived were the dwellings themselves, scattered across territories where winter had once killed with reliable frequency, standing as evidence that one woman's refusal to accept preventable death had changed how thousands of people approached survival. The story of earth-sheltered dwelling on the American frontier demonstrates that profound innovation often emerges not from theoretical knowledge, but from desperate need, combined with careful observation. Mehitabel Increase had no engineering training, no architectural education, no formal preparation for the work she undertook. She had grief, determination, and willingness to trust physics over tradition. Those proved sufficient to create solutions that saved lives for generations. Her legacy wasn't carved in stone monuments or preserved in written tributes. It was carved in darkness, in cool earthen chambers where families slept warm while blizzards raged overhead, in spaces that proved a mother's grief could generate innovations more lasting than any conventional memorial.